She's not the kind of woman a man like you marries. The words came out low and cold, the way Harlan Pruitt said most things, like he was stating a law of nature rather than passing judgment on his son's choices. Declan Pruitt didn't flinch. He stood by the fireplace with his hat in his hands, turning the brim slow between his fingers the way he did when he was working hard, not to say something he'd regret. The fire behind him threw long shadows across the parlor floor, and the whole room smelled like cedar smoke and old money, and something that had been rotting quietly for years without anyone naming it. She's exactly the kind of woman, Declan said, that I'm going to marry. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It had weight to it. 3 weeks earlier, Britta Solen had been stacking feed sacks in the back of Aldridge's supply when Declan walked in out of the October dust. She didn't look up right away. She rarely did when strangers came in. She'd learned a long time ago that strangers in Cutter's Bend usually wanted something she wasn't in a position to give. But she heard his boots on the floorboards, unhurried. The kind of walk that belonged to a man who'd never had to rush toward anything in his life. "You Britta?" he asked. She set the sack down and turned. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his early 30s, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved by weather rather than years. Not handsome in the easy way. Handsome in the way that made you look twice and then feel annoyed at yourself for looking. "Depends who's asking," she said. He almost smiled. "Declan Pruitt. My foreman says you're the best hand with a difficult horse in the county." "Your foreman's right," she said, and went back to the sacks. He hired her the next morning. The Pruitt Ranch sat 7 miles outside of Cutter's Bend, Texas, and it was the kind of place that made a person feel small before they even reached the gate. 1,200 acres of good grassland, a main house with a wraparound porch and actual glass in every window, and a horse operation that moved more stock in a season than most outfits moved in 3 years. Harlan Pruitt had built it. He never let anyone forget that. Britta arrived with her saddle over one shoulder and a canvas bag over the other, and the first person she met was a woman named Cecilia Drummond, who stood on the porch of the main house and looked at Britta the way a person looks at a stain they're not sure will come out. Cecilia was Harlan's choice for Declan. Everyone in the county knew it. She had money from her father's land holdings, east of Abilene. She had manners that had been drilled into her since childhood, and she had a way of standing in any room that said she already owned it. She was beautiful in the arranged, deliberate way of women who had always been told beauty was their primary purpose. She looked at Britta's dusty boots and then looked away, as if the looking itself had been an imposition. Britta went to the barn. The problem horse was a gray stallion they called Grayson, which was not creative, but then nobody at the Pruitt Ranch was particularly interested in creativity. He'd thrown 2 hands in the past month and left one of them with a broken collarbone. He stood at the back of his stall with his ears flat and his eyes rolling white around the edges, and Britta stood at the stall door for a long time without going in. "You coming in or just visiting?" said a voice behind her. She turned. An older man with a silver mustache and a permanently skeptical expression was leaning on the partition. Virgil Hatch, the foreman, she'd learn later. He had the look of a man who'd been proven right about most things and had grown tired of it. "Visiting first," she said. "You can't rush an introduction." Virgil said nothing, but something shifted in his expression. Approval, maybe. The quiet kind. It took Britta 4 days with Grayson before she put a saddle on him. 4 days of standing in the stall, talking low, moving slow, letting him decide she wasn't a threat. By the time she swung up on him on the 5th morning, he was still nervous, but nervous was manageable. Nervous, she understood. It was the fear underneath the anger that you had to wait out. Declan watched from the fence. He didn't say anything, which she appreciated. Men who watched someone work and couldn't help but offer instruction. She'd met plenty of those, and not one of them had ever taught her a thing. When she rode Grayson out of the paddock at a steady trot, she heard the foreman somewhere behind her say, "Told you." She didn't know who he was telling. The evenings that October were cool enough to be comfortable and warm enough to stay outside, and Britta fell into the habit of sitting on the fence after supper, looking out at the flat dark of the range. It was on one of those evenings that Declan came and sat beside her. Not close, not intrusively, just present. They talked about the horses first, and then about the land, and then, by the 3rd evening, about other things, about where she'd grown up. East Texas, a town so small it had 2 churches and 1 argument, about what had brought her to Cutter's Bend, her mother's sister, who'd taken sick, who'd recovered, who'd said Britta could stay as long as she liked, about what kind of winter the range usually saw. She didn't tell him about the year after her father left, when her mother had taken in laundry to feed the 2 of them, or about the winter she'd spent sleeping in a livery, because the room she'd been renting went to someone who could pay more. She didn't tell him those things because they weren't his business. But she noticed, as the weeks went on, that he listened. actually listened, the way most people didn't, not waiting for a pause so he could say what he'd already planned to say, but actually following what she said and responding to it. It was such a simple thing. It shouldn't have meant as much as it did. The trouble began when Cecilia started watching. Not obviously. Cecilia Drummond was too practiced for anything obvious. But Britta caught it. The way Cecilia positioned herself in the parlor window when Declan was in the yard, the way dinner conversations at the main house became interrogations dressed as pleasantries. Cecilia had the gift of saying something entirely cutting while keeping her tone perfectly warm, so that if you called her on it, you sounded like the unreasonable one. "You must find ranch work satisfying," she said to Britta once, at the table, "given that it seems to be the only kind of work you're suited for." Britta buttered her bread and said nothing. Harlan, at the head of the table, said nothing either, but he smiled into his glass in a way that told her everything she needed to know about whose side he was on. Declan looked at Cecilia. "She's the best hand I've had on this property in 6 years," he said, "including men twice her size." And then he went back to his supper like he hadn't said anything at all. That was the first moment Britta felt something shift. Not hope, exactly. She'd learned to be careful with hope. But something. The night everything changed was a Saturday in late November, when Harlan threw what he called a dinner, and what was actually an audience. 30 people in the main house. Bankers, ranchers, men who owned things and women who'd been married into those things. Britta was not invited. She knew that. She wasn't the kind of person Harlan Pruitt invited to dinner, and she didn't want to be. She stayed in the barn that evening, checking a mare who'd been running a slight fever, and told herself she was glad to be there. She was mostly telling the truth. She heard the voices from the house, the laughter, the particular sound of men congratulating each other on their own success. She heard Cecilia's voice once, bright and carrying, the way a voice gets when it's performing. She didn't hear Declan. Around 9 o'clock, she heard the barn door open, and when she looked up, he was standing in the doorway in his good shirt with his collar open, holding his hat. "Thought you'd be at the party," she said. "I was." He came in and leaned against the stall partition. "My father announced the engagement," he said. "To Cecilia, in front of everyone." He looked at the mare, not at Britta. "He didn't ask me first." The barn was very quiet. "What are you going to do?" she said. He looked at her then, directly in the way he'd been not quite looking at her for weeks. "What I should have done 6 weeks ago," he said, and said what I meant. She waited. "I don't want to marry Cecilia Drummond," he said. "I want to court you, if you'll allow it." Britta looked at him for a long time. She thought about the way her mother had worked herself thin for a man who didn't stay. She thought about every room she'd ever been in where someone had looked through her like she was furniture. She thought about Grayson on the first morning, the flat ears, the rolled eyes, the fear that looked like anger. "You understand what that means," she said. "What your father will say. I know exactly what he'll say. And I've been letting him say things for 34 years, Declan said. "I'm tired." Harlan Pruitt said it the next morning in the parlor with the fire going and the November light coming flat and cold through the windows. "She's not the kind of woman a man like you marries." Declan stood with his hat in his hands. "She's exactly the kind of woman I'm going to marry." Harlan set his coffee down very carefully. He was a precise man, Harlan. Everything he did was deliberate. "She has nothing," he said. "No family, no money, no name. Everything I've built, this house, this land, this operation, requires someone who can stand beside you in the proper way. Cecilia is a business arrangement," Declan said. "And I'm not a parcel of land. You are the continuation of everything I've spent my life creating. That comes with obligations." "It comes with your obligations," Declan said. "Not mine." The room got very still. Outside, a horse whinnied. The fire popped. Harlan looked at his son the way he looked at figures that didn't add up, like the problem was with the numbers, not with the ledger. "If you do this," he said, "I'll cut you out. Every acre, every horse, everything. I'll give it to your cousin before I give it to a son who throws it away on sentiment." Declan put his hat on. "Then give it to Warren," he said. "I expect he'll know what to do with it." He walked out. Britta was in the paddock with Grayson when Declan came through the barn. She could read a man's walk by now the way she could read a horse's ears. This one said something had broken, and he wasn't sure yet if that was a good thing or a bad thing. "Well," she said. "He means it," Declan said. "About the land." She waited. "So do I," he said. "About you." She looked at him across the fence rail. 26 years old, and she'd worked harder than most men twice her age, and she'd learned not to lean on things that might give way. She'd learned to test a fence before she trusted it. "What do you have?" she said carefully. "If he follows through?" 15 years of cattle contacts, he said. "Enough saved to lease ground. Virgil says he'll come with me if I go." He paused. "And whatever you decide." She thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, she saddled Grayson. calm now, responsive, the fear in him quiet, and rode him out to the east pasture, and sat there in the December morning looking at the land and the sky, and thought about what it meant to build something from the ground up versus what it meant to inherit something already built. She'd always been building from the ground up. She knew how to do that. What she didn't anticipate was Cecilia. Not Cecilia's anger, that she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was Cecilia showing up at Virgil's cottage one evening, alone, without the performance, and sitting down at the kitchen table and saying, very quietly, that she wanted to talk. Britta sat across from her and said nothing, and waited. "I'm not in love with Declan," Cecilia said. "I want you to know that. I'm not. This isn't about love for me." She looked at her hands. "It's about what happens to me if this arrangement falls apart. My father has debts, significant ones. If I don't—" She stopped, started again. "I've been trained my whole life for one purpose," she said. "To marry well enough to stabilize my family's position. If that falls apart, I don't have anything. I don't have a skill. I don't have a trade. I don't have—" She laughed, a short, unhappy sound. "I can't shoe a horse. I can't run a breeding program. I've been made into exactly the right ornament for exactly the right room, and outside of that room I'm—" She didn't finish. Britta looked at her. Really looked. Maybe for the first time. She saw something she recognized. Not the circumstances, which were nothing like her own, but the shape of it. The way a person could be shaped into something by someone else's hands and wake up one morning not sure who they'd have been if anyone had ever asked. "What do you actually want?" Britta said. "Not what your father wants you." Cecilia was quiet for a long time. "I wanted to study law," she said finally, "in Austin. When I was 16. She said it like she was confessing something embarrassing. My father laughed. Britta nodded slowly. "Then tell your father," she said, "that the arrangement fell apart because Declan broke it, not because of anything you did or didn't do. And then go to Austin. It's not that simple." "No," Britta agreed. "It's not. But simple's not really the standard you're working with, is it?" Something moved across Cecilia's face. Not gratitude, exactly. Something older than that. The look of a person who'd been given a lantern in a dark room. Not a way out, but at least enough light to see the walls. She left without saying much more. But she left different from how she'd come in. Harlan made his move in January. He went to the 3 largest buyers in the region and told them quietly that Declan had left the operation. Left it in bad standing, with debts unresolved and contracts in question. None of it was true. But Harlan had spent 30 years building a name in that county, and a name like his carried the weight of truth, even when it was carrying lies. Declan found out through Virgil, who found out through a hand who'd overheard a conversation in a feed store. He sat with it for an afternoon, and then he saddled his horse and rode into Cutter's Bend and walked into the office of every buyer Harlan had visited and told them the truth, plainly, without anger. He showed them contracts. He showed them records. He said simply that he was starting his own operation and that he'd like the chance to earn their trust on the merits. 2 of the 3 said they'd see how the season went. The third one, a man named Bill Archer, who'd known Declan's grandfather, shook his hand and said he'd already decided not to believe Harlan. "Your father's a man who uses words the way he uses money," Archer said, "to make people smaller." He signed a contract that afternoon. Britta heard about it that evening. She was sitting on the steps of the leased bunkhouse they'd set up on 20 acres east of town, mending a bridle when Declan rode back and told her. "1 out of 3, she said. 1 out of 3, he agreed. He sat down on the step below her. "You think that's enough to start on?" She looked at him. She thought about the first horse she'd ever gentled, a bad-tempered bay her uncle had written off as unfixable. She'd spent 3 weeks on that horse. People had told her she was wasting her time. The horse had eventually become the steadiest animal her uncle owned. "Start small," she said, "and build honest." "Yeah, that's enough." The hardest part, in the months that followed, wasn't the work. Britta had never been afraid of work. It was the county. The way a small community could turn a story into a verdict without hearing all the evidence. She felt eyes on her when she went into town. She heard the way certain women adjusted their conversations when she walked into Aldridge's supply. She knew what they said, that she'd set her sights on the Pruitt fortune and ruined things for Declan in the process. She didn't fight it. She'd learned that the best argument against a story was a different story, told slowly, in actions rather than words. She worked. She trained horses that other outfits had given up on. She built a reputation in the county that was entirely her own, not borrowed from Declan's name, not built on anyone's generosity. Her own, earned. By spring, 3 other ranches had hired her to work problem horses. By summer, one of them offered her a small training contract. Declan watched all of this without saying anything about it. He had his own work to do, rebuilding contacts, running lean, making every dollar earn its keep. They were tired most nights. Some evenings they didn't talk much at all, just sat on the steps in the cooling dark and let the quiet be enough. But one evening in August, Declan's younger sister arrived. Her name was Hattie, short for Harriet, which she'd hated since she was 6, and she came down from San Antonio with a carpet bag and an expression that suggested she'd had a long argument with herself about whether to come at all. She was 23, slender, with her brother's dark hair and their father's jaw, and none of her father's certainty about anything. Britta had heard she existed. She hadn't known what to expect. Hattie sat down at the table in the leased house, looked at Britta directly, and said, "I owe you an apology." Britta waited. "I didn't speak up," Hattie said. "When father made his announcement at dinner, when he started spreading things about Declan around the county, I wrote letters that I didn't send. I convinced myself it wasn't my place, that I couldn't change anything, that father would." She stopped. "I've been telling myself that lie for years, that nothing I said would matter. But I think the truth is I was afraid of what he'd take from me, and that's not the same thing as being helpless. That's just being a coward with better excuses." The room was quiet. Britta said, "Did you send the letters now?" Hattie blinked. Yes, to the buyers in the county, and to 2 men on father's land board. I told them what I knew, what I'd witnessed." She looked at her hands. "I don't know if it'll help." "It might," Britta said. "And then, because it was true, it's not nothing, what you did." Hattie looked at her for a long moment. "Declan told me you were like this," she said. "Like what?" "Honest without being cruel about it." Declan from the doorway said, "I believe I said honest and reasonable, which is apparently a combination rare enough to require comment." Britta threw the dish towel at him. "Harlan Pruitt came in September. He arrived unannounced, which was how he did most things, believing that his presence was itself an invitation to comply. He rode up to the leased property on a Tuesday morning when the air was just turning and dismounted at the fence, with the stiffness of a man who'd been sitting a horse less than he used to. Britta was in the near paddock working a young roan when he arrived. She saw him. She finished the exercise before she went to the fence, because the horse needed that, and because she was not going to shorten her work because Harlan Pruitt had finally decided to make an appearance. He watched her work without saying anything. She gave him that. He didn't interrupt. When she came to the fence, he looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the beginning, measuring, assessing, sorting her into categories. "You've done well," he said finally, like he was granting something. "Yes," she said. "We have." The "we" landed. He looked away, out at the range, at the small operation they'd built. Modest, clean, nothing like the Pruitt Ranch, but real. His son's hands had built it, his son's judgment. "I made mistakes," he said, and the words came out like they cost him money. "In how I handled certain things." Britta waited. "I won't pretend to have changed my opinions entirely," he said. He was a precise man. He didn't traffic in wholesale reversals. "But I may have." He paused. "There are things I said that I said because I'd made decisions, and I didn't want to unmake them. Not because they were right." It was, Britta understood, about as close to an apology as Harlan Pruitt was ever going to come. She didn't tell him it was enough. She didn't tell him she forgave him. She said, "Declan's in the barn." And then she went back to the roan. She heard Harlan's boots on the dry ground, moving toward the barn. She didn't watch him go. The wedding was small the following April on a clear morning that smelled like new grass and creek water. Virgil stood beside Declan. Hattie stood beside Britta. Bill Archer and his wife came. A handful of others. Harlan came too. He stood at the back, hat in his hands, and he didn't say anything during the ceremony, and Britta didn't look at him. But when it was over and people were talking and the morning light was good and warm, she saw him cross the yard and shake Declan's hand, and she saw something move across Declan's face that she couldn't quite name and didn't try to. Some things didn't need naming. That afternoon, she and Declan rode out to the east edge of their leased acres, 23 acres now. They'd been able to add 3 in the fall, and sat their horses at the top of a low rise and looked at what they'd built. The barn was smaller than anything Harlan owned. The pasture fence needed work in the northeast corner. The bunkhouse was 4 walls and determination and not much else. But the horses were good and honest and well handled, and the ground was clean, and every board and every contract and every dollar that had gone into it had come from somewhere they were not ashamed to name. "I keep waiting for someone to tell us we did it wrong," Declan said. Britta looked at the grass moving in the April wind. She thought about her mother ironing other people's shirts before dawn. She thought about the livery in winter. She thought about Grayson on that first morning, the fear that looked like anger, the patience it took to wait it out. "Let them," she said. They rode back as the light started to go golden, and the day settled around them, easy and quiet, the way good things do when they finally stopped being fought over and started being lived.